Hello, my name is Amanda Roche, and on the behalf of the Atlantic Institute, I want to welcome you to the book launch of The Mapmaker of the Pope by Dr. Ron Messier, and thank you for being here. We're going to get started with a little bit about the author. Dr. Ronald Messier is a professor emeritus in history at Middle Tennessee State University, where he taught Islamic history and historical archaeology from 1972 to 2004, and he was also the director of the honors program for 10 years. He's been an adjunct professor and senior lecturer at Vanderbilt University and received his MA and PhD degrees from the University of Michigan. He's the president of the advisory board for the Atlantic Institute of Tennessee, which is hosting this event. His teaching and research focuses on Islam and the history of archaeology of the Middle East and North Africa. From 1987 to 98, he directed the excavation of the ancient city of Sijil Massa in Morocco, famous for its gold trade and its contacts with Timbuktu. He's currently directing an archaeology project at Agma near Marrakesh, Morocco. He's published over 24 articles and authored, co-authored, or edited multiple books, his most recent, of course, being The Mapmaker and the Pope. He's won several teaching awards, including the Case Tennessee Professor of the Year Award in 1993. And as a former student of his in the honors program, I can certainly attest to his value as a teacher. Since 1992, he's been the lecturer for over 40 study tours, including tours to Morocco, Israel, Spain, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, Turkey, Oman, Mali, and Timbuktu. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Messier, for being here. And the format tonight will be some questions and conversation between Dr. Messier and I, and then there'll be a chance for you all to be able to ask some questions in the comments of the chat. So we'll go ahead and jump in. This book has parallel stories of two men who eventually meet, Gerbert, and who later became Pope Sylvester II. It's a historical figure, and Hakeem, who is an actual character based on the mapmaker Muhammad, I hope I get this right, Qasim ibn Hakul. Can you talk about your choice of these two people for this book?
Yeah, well, thank you, Amanda, and I also want to thank the Atlantic Institute for organizing this, and to thank all of you out there somewhere in cyberspace who are tuning in. But you know, I started thinking about this project a very long time ago. I was actually in graduate school. And I can be very specific about it. In the summer of 1967, believe it or not, that was a long time ago, I was privileged to sign up for a seminar with a visiting professor. I was at the University of Michigan. And we had a visiting professor, the distinguished Professor Claude Cahin, who was a professor at the Sorbonne in Paris. And one of the very famous articles that he wrote that he was well known for was an article entitled L'impérialisme des Fatimides. The Fatimids, was a rival dynasty to the dynasty in Baghdad. And he wrote about their imperialistic goals. To accomplish those goals, the Fatimids recruited basically undercover agents to sort of gather intelligence about prospective places that they thought they could overtake or to influence in one way or another. And in the article, he identified the mapmaker, Ibn Hakul, as one of those undercover agents, or I call him a spy. He was essentially a spy. And a couple of years later, I was doing field work for my dissertation in Cairo, Egypt. And I was studying at the Société Géographique d'Égypte, and I was looking at ancient maps And some of the maps that I was looking at were the maps of Ibn Hawqal. And particularly his regional map of the Mediterranean just blew my mind. It looked, now bear in mind that he's drawing this map in the middle of the 10th century, in the middle 900s. That's over 1100 years ago. And the map that he drew looked amazingly like the Mediterranean. And so I was asking myself, how in the devil did he learn how to do that? I mean, can you imagine drawing a map of, well, those of us here in Tennessee, could you draw a map of Tennessee without ever having seen a map of Tennessee? Okay, so that was the situation with Ibn Hawqal drawing his map of the Mediterranean. And then I asked myself, why did he do that? Why did he draw this map? And of course, this was part of his intelligence report. He was basically weighing the options of expansion in one direction or another, gathering information, very detailed information about places, which he then wrote in his book, illustrated by these maps. I'm thinking, what a great combination, a map maker who's a spy. Right, so that's one of the characters. Gerbert d'Aurillac, the future Pope Sylvester II, I bumped into when I was working in Fez, Morocco in the mid-1980s. So there is a very strong tradition in Morocco, especially in Fez, Morocco, that Gerbert d'Aurillac, as a young man, Gerbert incidentally becomes a very famous mathematician and astronomer. And so he, according to this strong tradition, he went to the University of the Karawayin Mosque in Fez and spent some time there. Well, Ibn Hawqal also spent time at the Karawayin University in Fez. And so, and this part is fiction, of course, the two of these men meet and they compare notes. And they're doing essentially the same thing on a different scale. So Ibn Hawqal is, or Hakeem in the book, is drawing maps of the world as he travels through the world. And Gerbert, the future pope, is mapping the sky. He's mapping the stars that he sees on the celestial sphere. And the process was a lot similar. And so they're comparing notes on how to do this. And they become very close friends, and they share all kinds of thoughts well beyond the science that they were doing.
Great. So, yeah, it's really fascinating. Especially, I found it, I was kind of eager for the two stories to come together. In the book, they're paralleled for quite some time, and we don't get to see them come together for a while. So that was a great suspense. I'm curious to know, since you have authored or co-authored or edited multiple nonfiction, why fiction now? And also just maybe talk about how the process was a little bit, I would imagine, different from some of your previous projects.
Yeah. Going back to when I first started thinking about the Mapmaker, as much as I was impressed by the work that he did, by the maps that he drew and the detailed descriptions that he wrote, describing the places that he went, we have very little information about himself as a person. I mean, he did not write about himself, and nor do we have any biographies that were ever written about him then or now. So we have almost no biographical information about this person. We do know where he was at certain points because he tells us that in his book. We do have some idea of things that he thought about because some of his emotions, his reactions to places, his reactions to some discussions that he had are also written in the book. So we do gain some insight of things that he talked about. For example, his sympathy for the Fatimid rulers was very clear. Hence, it was easy to make the case or to substantiate the case that he was, in fact, a spy working for the Fatimids. So the only way to really write about this person as a person and to try to get into his head was fiction. And that's why I changed his name, actually, because I just didn't feel comfortable saying that Ibn Hawqal did this and Ibn Hawqal did that when I didn't really know. It was much easier as far as the future pope was concerned because we have a lot of information about him. And there are many biographies about him. But then that was another reason I said, we don't really need another biography of Pope Sylvester II. Why not tell an interesting story? Now, the reason that they're parallel lives for, really almost the first half of the book is that I really was very interested in writing about how they came to know what they needed to know in order to do the work they did in their professional lives. So again, how did the mapmaker learn how to make the maps? How did Pope Sylvester, how did he learn how to map the skies? And that we don't know a whole lot about. I had to speculate a lot about that. So that's why I decided to do historical fiction.
Right.
Having decided that was one thing. Learning how to do it was quite, because it was so different. One of the first things I learned is that I had no idea how to write historical fiction. I had no idea what the challenges would really be, and there were all kinds of challenges. The first thing that I wrote was the prologue, and so you read the prologue, and it's so the Pope is now Pope. It's really at the very end of his life, close to the end of his life, and he's I should point out one of the things that makes him such an interesting character is that he became Pope in the year 999, just a few months before the end of the millennium. And so, those of us who are old enough to remember 20 years ago or 21 years ago, Y2K, well, Pope Sylvester was dealing with Y1K. And so this story unfolds against that background. So now to go back to the question of historical fiction, much of Gerbert's life, the biographers don't deal with. So I imagine him having grown up in a peasant family in South Central France, in a small little hamlet not too far from the little town of Aurillac. In fact, his name is Gerbert d'Aurillac. Mm-hmm. And his family ran into some tough times. His father fell way behind in his manorial rents, and he was a serf in service to the local monastery. So his feudal lord was the abbot of the monastery. And in lieu of paying his rents, the abbot suggested that the family turn over their youngest son to the monastery, and that was Gerbert d'Aurillac. And he was extremely precocious. He went to the Abbey school, and he very quickly went through the few books that they had in the Abbey. The teacher that he had there was a mathematician. He taught arithmetic, and Gerbert learned arithmetic very quickly. In fact, he developed this system to do calculations on his fingers as fast as we could do today with a calculator. And so that part is pretty much made up. I knew where he ended up. I knew what he knew. I could read in historical sources what he knew after his education was completed, and I had to kind of figure out how did he get there, and so fiction worked well for that.
Right.
Now, in learning how to do fiction, I do mention this in my acknowledgments, actually. I joined a group in Murfreesboro, the Murfreesboro Writers Group, which is a group of dedicated writers of fiction who meet every single Wednesday night, and we read each other's work in increments of 5 pages a week. So over many, 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 many weeks, 5 pages a week, that group, basically read through or listen to me read through the Mapmaker. And at first, their criticisms were many, and it became clear to me that I really didn't understand this process. I didn't really know how to handle dialogue. I wasn't that good at painting verbal pictures of places. But with a lot of coaching from my fellow friends at the Murfreesboro writers groups, I became better at this, and I think it turned out okay in terms of dialogue and pictures.
Yeah, it certainly felt very natural. The dialogue felt very natural to me as a reader.
Well, it did not at first. Let me assure you that it did not at first. Now, there was another challenge in doing historical fiction. For historical fiction, I think, to be good historical fiction, it has to be consistent with the time and place.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the prologue, the prologue starts or it takes place at the end of the Pope's life. So he's in Rome. And he's getting ready. So it's on December 31st. He's getting ready to go to midnight mass, celebrating the circumcision of Jesus, which is January 1st. And I'm wondering, where did this happen? I mean, it could not have happened in the Vatican. The Vatican didn't exist in the 10th century.
Oh.
So a challenge was to figure out where in the devil could the Pope have had this conversation with his secretary. And it turned out that it was in the Papal Palace, which was very different than the Papal Palace today. It was in a building right next door to the Church of St. John Lateran that's there today. And then, as you read in the prologue, the Pope and his secretary ride across the city of Rome from the Papal Palace to St. Peter's, which is way on the other side of town. And they're riding in this carriage through the city, but it's not Rome of the Caesars, and it's not Rome of today. It's the Rome of the 10th century. What did that look like? Huh. I had no idea. I mean, it took me a long time to figure out how to do that.
Right.
So to make that consistent with what I think was really the case in the 10th century, that was a big challenge. And for historical fiction to be good historical fiction, I think it's important to do that. And that there was one other factor, and I think actually I want to just read about this because this comes from the notes at the very beginning of the book.
Uh-huh.
And I quote this author of historical fiction. Actually, her writing had a big influence on me. Elizabeth Hickey is her name, and the first book that I read of hers was called The Painted Kiss, and it's the story of the Viennese painter Gustav Klimt and his relationship with his favorite model. And this is what she writes about historical fiction. She says, "The act of writing historical fiction is inherently a compromise. The literal truth, as opposed to the artistic truth of characters' lives, rarely, if ever, allows for the successful plotting of a novel." And then a little bit further on in her essay, she says, "The aim of historical fiction is not to render the past exactly as it happened, an impossible task, but to imagine it as it might have happened." And I think the word imagine is really important here. So that's what historical fiction turns out to be. Now,
I remember reading that last quote in the preface, and it's very striking. It seems like quite a lot of responsibility because you want to be true, and especially being this historian that you are, you really need to be true to the history, but then you also have to use your imagination to fill in all the blanks too. So it seems like quite a task. So I want to talk a little bit about the Atlantic Institute's mission is to promote peace and understanding through interfaith dialogue and cultural exchange. And over your years of involvement with the Atlantic Institute, you've certainly had a chance to engage in a lot of that. And in addition to all of that you've done as a teacher and a traveler and a researcher. So I was curious about this. You had to write the dialogue from both perspectives of a Muslim and a Christian, and different characters as well that are discussing their faith. I'm curious if you had any either new insights or affirmation about interfaith dialogue through the process of writing this book.
What I learned about the process, I had been doing it. I mean, I've worked in the Middle East for over 35 years. And so I've had many, many, many dialogues with people there. And many of them were, I would say, interfaith dialogues. But I never really thought about the process. It just happened. You engage in dialogue. But that's what became clear to me as I started writing the dialogues down here. And I must say that some of the dialogues that show up in the novel are dialogues that I've actually had with Muslims. But I had to think about, it's the first time I articulated to myself how that happens. And what's interesting about how it happens is that rarely do two people of different faiths sit down and say, okay, let's talk about the Trinity. I mean, it just doesn't work well that way. Much more often, almost always, you're talking about whatever. You're talking about the weather. You're talking about what you're going to have for dinner. Or you're talking about your work as a map maker or as an astronomer. And somehow something happens where you fall into a discussion about really weighty things of one's faith. And I think the reason that that's the case, interfaith dialogue takes place almost as a result of something else you're doing, is that interfaith dialogue is not easy. I think it's a person has to be really, really strong in their faith to engage in genuine interfaith dialogue. Strong in their faith in the sense of being very confident in their faith. And it doesn't always work. I've had many conversations about faith, and some of them went well and some of them did not go so well. But let me give you an example of one of them from the book here. So let's see here. So this is a dialogue between the map maker and Gerbert. And this is shortly after this takes place. So a little bit of background to the dialogue. This takes place when the map maker, again, after they had been friends for a while, the map maker, who remember is a spy, and so he's really not terribly open about what he really does for a living. I mean, he's very guarded about that. But after he got to know the monk pretty well, he decided, well, I'm going to show him my map. And what the map wasn't finished yet, but he said, I'm going to show him. And so he showed him the map, and one of the places marked on the map was Bethlehem. Okay, so here's the way the dialogue goes. Let me tell you a story about my journey to Bethlehem. You mean the birthplace of our Lord? You have actually been there? Yes, the birthplace of the prophet Jesus, may peace be upon him. I was just passing through when I first left Baghdad to seek out my teacher, who moved to Egypt. What struck me most was observing lines of worshipers, both Muslim and Christian, merging to file into this tiny little church that contained a relic, a palm branch that allegedly fed the Virgin Mary, mother of Jesus, may peace be upon him, and the Holy Family as they fled to Egypt. to escape the wrath of King Herod. Gerbert was astonished. This short narrative gave rise to so many questions that he had trouble deciding which one to ask first. Muslims believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? Yes, of course. No Muslim would ever doubt that. Our Holy Quran is very explicit about it. Hakeem had not memorized the entire Quran as his father had, but he remembered these key verses, and then he quotes this long passage. I'll read the passage. So this is from the Quran now, translated into English. We went to Mary, our spirit. He appeared to her as an immaculate human. She said, I take refuge from you in the most merciful, should you be righteous. He said, this is the angel Gabriel is who she's talking to here. I am only the messenger of your Lord to give you the gift of a pure son. She said, how can I have a son when no man has touched me, and I was never unchaste? He said, thus said your Lord, it is easy for me, and we will make him a sign for humanity and a mercy from us. It is a matter already decided. So she carried him and secluded herself with him in a remote place. And then Gerbert reacts. Your scripture mentions Mary and Jesus? Was Gerbert's next question. Mentions them, exclaimed Hakeem. It does more than mention. There is an entire chapter about the mother of Jesus. It is called the chapter of Mary. Jesus himself appears more than 30 times in the Quran. And then, and it continues about that. They talk about that for another, page and a half. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of dialogue in this book. Yeah, a big, which is, and like I said earlier, it feels very, very natural. Okay, I have one more question before we get to some questions from people that are listening. And that is, what do you anticipate the readership of the book will be? And is there something that you hope readers will glean from it, will take with them after the experience of reading this book?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've thought a lot about that, and I would hope that the readership is, first of all, anyone who's interested in a good spy story. I mean, it is a spy story, so in addition to the process of learning some pretty hard science, only the science that was available up through the 10th century. That was in itself a challenge, not to rely on any science that postdates the 10th century. But in addition to all of this scientific stuff, let me stop there. Let me say, among the people who might be interested is people who are interested in the history of science, which I was not particularly. One of the challenges was how to describe an astrolabe. I had no idea. In fact, one of the things I did to be able to describe an astrolabe was to make an astrolabe. I made an astrolabe out of some heavy cardboard, and it was flimsy and it didn't really work very well. So then I decided to break down and actually buy an astrolabe with detailed descriptions how to use it. But in addition to all of that, there's a tremendous amount of political intrigue. I mean, Hakeem the Mapmaker was a professional spy. And he was so initially reluctantly. He was not really, he was really interested in his studies, but he was kind of goaded into doing one spy mission, which was short-term, pretty simple, worked out really well. So he was given a second mission that was a little bit more complicated and a little bit more risky. And that went okay. And so his missions kept accumulating and becoming more complex and more dangerous. And as you read the story, you know that he was imprisoned. He was nearly killed at least twice. Um, and yeah, so that's people interested in historical science, people interested in a good spy story, people interested in other places. You know, I really worked very hard at, once I started to learn how to do it and gradually became a little better at it, how to paint pictures with words. Um, and I'd like to think that the scenes where these places took place, and you know, a lot of the story takes place, for example, in Sigil Massa, where I spent 10 years excavating. Well, not many people have any clue what Sigil Massa looked like in the 10th century. I can assure you of that. But I can tell you what Sigil Massa looked like in the 10th century, and I do. Um, and One of my favorite scenes is that scene in the desert when he's crossing the desert from Sigil Massa to Ghana, and how he was so amazed. And that was a new experience for him. He had traveled an awful lot, but the point at which he actually was out in the desert in this great sea of sand was based on my experiences, actually. I mean, what I was writing about were my first experiences of going out into the desert where you can't see anything but sand in every single direction. So if people are interested in visual pictures and words, I think that this might have something to offer. And then, of course, there's the interfaith dialogue as a process and as a certain amount of content. And then, you know, at some level, I think writers hope that in some small way, what they have to say has some, at some level, universal truth. You know, is there some message here? And I think there is. You know, on the back cover of the book, one of the blurbs ends his statement by saying, "But the most powerful insights the book offers are to human nature and intellectual curiosity, presented in this most enjoyable historical fiction." And then, you know, the book has been out for a little over 4 days now. And I have gotten some comments, and I'd like to read this one to kind of affirm what I just said. So this is someone that I know. "Ron, I'm continuing to enjoy reading this book. I look forward to my reading time each day. I'm interested to see what happens next in the personal lives of the characters and enjoying the cultural insights the story provides. The events take place in a location on the other side of the world and in an era that is vastly different from present day. Yet the story reveals human traits and characteristics that are timeless and universal throughout the earth. Thanks for all of the diligent work that you put into this."
Wow, that's beautifully said, and I would have to agree, having read the book recently too. I found sometimes I just kind of couldn't put it down because I wanted to see what was going to happen next, and that was something that I didn't really anticipate when I was, you know, starting to read a historical novel. I also found myself looking at maps, just kind of double checking that I knew where, you know, all the things were happening. And as a visual person, I will say I so appreciated the graphics and the drawings that you included, especially on some of that harder science stuff, because that really,
Like an astrolabe, to describe how an astrolabe works.
yeah. Yeah, that would have taken a lot longer. So if it's okay with you, we've got a few minutes left. We could ask our people that are listening online, if you have any comments or questions for Dr. Messier, you can put them in the chat. And I should be able to pull those up. And while we're waiting for that, I do want to say, so Umet has put the link directly to the book in the comments. And also, if you would like a signed copy, because obviously you can't do that in person, you can contact Dr. Messier at messier.ron@gmail.com. Is that right?
Mhm.
Or through the publication, the press. And you can arrange to have, through the postal service, a signed copy if you like. And let me make sure, anybody out there have any questions or comments? I'm okay. So Jane Tyler says, I am now anxious to read this book. I believe it's on a Kindle edition too. It's available on Kindle as well as in print form. Okay, Mrs. Botchak, what part of your personality do we think we can find in these characters?
Uh, Yeah, I'm not, I don't know about personality, but a lot of these experiences are my experiences. And I could give you many examples. For example, all right, so, I mentioned that that I believe that Gerbert was from a peasant family and his family ran into hard times and they turned him over to the local monastery. Well, I envision that to have happened when Gerbert was 13 years old. And there's this scene where his parents, his mother and his father and his older brother, take him by the hand to the monastery and turn him over to the abbot of the monastery. And that was one of my experiences. When I was 13 years old, I grew up Catholic and I went to a Catholic boarding school. And my family, my mother and my father and my older brother, took me to that school. I wasn't forced to go. It was a decision that I had made. But I'll never forget that day when I got there and my parents dropped me off and introduced me to the father superior of the school and got back in the car and left. And that's sort of what happens there when Gerbert shows up at the monastery with his mother and his father and his older brother. Um, and um, a lot of as I said, a lot of the dialogues are dialogues that I actually had. So I drew a lot from my experiences.
Right.
Mhm.
So people might actually read some words that they might have had a conversation with you and say similarly, like,
One of my other dear friends who read the book this week said that one of the characters, the character on the cover of the book,
mhm.
Mapmaker on the cover of the book, she said, somehow looks remarkably like you.
You knew the illustrator, I assume.
I
Or
did the illustrator, actually. I know the
oh,
designer who
mhm.
hired the illustrator.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Let's see. Here's another question. Do you correlate the places you have visited with the character places? Do you have an imaginary place that you wish to be real?
Huh. Gosh, I don't know how to answer that. There are no places that I completely made up. I mean, every place that appears in the book is a place that I have been to, and again have seen in a sense in the 10th century. Rome, going across Rome in the 10th century. I've been to Rome many times, but to write what it looked like in the 10th century, I had to go to archaeological reports and read about what Rome looked like. What churches were there in the 10th century? What did they look like? How long would it have taken to go from where the Pope lived to St. Peter's, which was a very different church than St. Peter's Cathedral today. So I didn't really make up places in the story.
Right.
I mean, even south of the desert. I mean, I've been to Timbuktu a number of times. Now, Timbuktu doesn't appear by name in the story because Timbuktu post-dates the 10th century as a place.
Right. Right. Oh, Yeah, you have really had some incredible travels to feed all of this imagery and knowledge and experiences.
Book is
Um,
about 250 pages long, but it took an awful lot of work to get those 250 pages.
right. Yeah. How long have you been working on this? I mean, I know you said you'd been thinking about it since what, 1967, but as
Yeah,
far as actually
I
the production.
I started actually writing it about 3.5 years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I was well retired by that point. I didn't need a publication for tenure or promotion, and that was a factor. When I started writing this, I knew that there was a good possibility that I would fall flat on my face in trying to write this. I also decided that if I was going to write something again, it would have to be fun. I wasn't going to write something that wasn't fun. And so, yeah, 3.5 years ago, I finally finished the book on Sigil Massa, which is an academic book on the excavations there that took place over 10 years. And then, so I was finished. Okay, so I said, well, all right, what am I going to do next? Well, it's got better be fun. That book that's been in the back of my head for so long. That's what I'm going to do.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we will wrap up. How do you think this book can help people living in this modern time in terms of friendship and understanding?
Well, it models dialogue. It places a very high premium on dialogue. And I think I would hope that it would inspire people who are in education, people who are struggling to learn. Because again, as you read the book, there are some pretty complicated concepts in this. For example, Gerbert is trying to understand this very complicated concept of stereographic projection. How do you draw something that's a sphere onto a flat surface? Well, there's an explanation how he did that in the book. And I warn people in my notes at the beginning of the book that you're going to get bogged down there. Well, why would you get bogged down there? Well, because that's a darn complicated process. And I'm hoping that the reader would experience the frustration that Gerbert had to have experienced when he was trying to learn those same things. So let me ask you, Amanda, were you frustrated when you went through?
If the stuff that I felt like I just couldn't get, I just accepted that I couldn't get. But I will say that part about the round globe on a flat surface, the description of the globe falling, and I think it was a donkey that tread upon it. That was, those simpler concepts were the imagery of that, and the anecdotes were fantastic. I would sometimes stop and look at the visuals that, like I said earlier, that really helped me. And then there were a few concepts that I just thought, I can't quite get it, but that's okay. I know enough
You know,
to,
and then there's that scene. Do you remember the scene where, and again, he was talking about stereographic projection, and this was when Gerbert was studying in Cordoba, and his teacher was actually not very much older than he was. Remember, and
yes.
they were living together, and so the teacher is frustrated too because he's explaining this stuff to Gerbert, and he just knows that Gerbert is not getting it. So he's thinking to himself, how in the heck can I explain this to Gerbert? And then all of a sudden it comes to him with those two soup bowls, the way he
Yes.
together.
And the
So
plate.
how did I think about that? Well, I thought about it one day when I was sitting at the table here and saw these two soup bowls on the table. And I thought, what if I put one soup bowl on top of the other, one upside down and one right side up, and put a plate in the middle to represent the equator? Would that work? And I think it worked.
Yeah. Yeah. That was certainly a clear image in my head when I read that part. Well, we are going to wrap up here. I do encourage all of you to follow Atlantic Institute on Facebook and subscribe to the YouTube channel. There will be more events coming up. They're not scheduled exactly yet, but Atlantic Institute, particularly during this pandemic, will be continuing to offer virtual events. And eventually, once again, we'll get back to in-person events. And anything else that you would like to add, Dr. Messier, before we say
Just
goodnight?
I'd like to thank everyone who's out there, and I'd like to hear from you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for joining us and have a good evening, everyone.